The first image that burned into every camera that night was the wheel cutting deep into the wet asphalt, sparks crawling like a cluster of angry fireflies. A chrome flank flashed, a passenger door hung open like a torn page, and above the sea of polished coats and flashbulbs a young woman's silhouette was a defiant comma, hinged to the side of a car that should have been upside down. She moved with an urgency that made time feel elastic. Her hands, which had once learned the language of wrenches and stubborn bolts in a dim, overheated garage, found purchase where no hand should reasonably be able to hold on. For a breathless string of seconds, the world contracted to the grit under her nails and the white of her father's face through the windshield. The car trembled on the edge of submission as if obeying some last, precarious instruction. Then a sound, a terrible, metallic keening unraveled the air. She braced, leaned back against the chrome like a hinge, and the vehicle, just for a sliver of a second, chose the horizontal. It did not flip. The press called it a miracle the next morning. The tabloids ran the word with its neat, inevitable serif. But in the bone of it, in the smell of burnt rubber and gasoline and the copper-sweet tang of fear, it was plainer and harder. A child's hands, a ragged shout, and an impossible choice taken in the split second when everything else seemed predetermined. She was Isabella Hale, Izzy to anyone who had watched her grow from a stubborn 10-year-old into the woman who had saved a billionaire's life with a pair of bruised knuckles and a certainty that came from knowing how machines failed when they were made to fail. The man in the driver's seat was Gideon Hale, her adoptive father, whose name in business columns ran like a headline: Hale Industries, Hale Holdings, Hale Philanthropy. He had money enough to buy silence, connections that could reroute consequences, an empire that glittered in the skyline. But even men with towers and lawyers could be clipped at the ankle by rumor. A ruined reputation could be engineered like an accident, and the city had learned that the hard way. Izzy pulled away from the car, breath coming in sharp, wet gasps, and for the briefest moment the crowd fell silent around them. First from shock, then from some animal, hungry impulse to witness. Gideon's eyes were wide and small with a mix of confusion and gratitude. He reached for his daughter as if for an anchor that would stop him from drifting into something weaker than the sharp bent of publicity. She gripped his wrist like a tether, more to hold herself upright than to steady him. Then the cameras flashed and the world resumed its appetite. They would replay the clip at every newscast, slow it down, point out the heroics and the peril, but none of it could explain why the car had almost tipped. Not yet. For that, one had to understand the months that led to that night. The series of failures that seemed to trail Hale's name like a stubborn shadow, the neat profits that materialized across town at a rival shop, and the small, unglamorous details that only someone like Izzy would notice. If this kind of tense rescue pulls at you and you want more stories where a single action changes everything, take a second to like and subscribe. There are more stories coming that unravel the moments when seconds make history. She had a way of seeing patterns other people called eccentric. Where others saw single incidents, she saw tapestry. A car that died at the worst possible moment was not merely bad luck, it might be a stitch cut. Hale Industries, despite its name, had never relied solely on reputation. Gideon's business was complex. Investments in logistics, a line of boutique electric sedans that had charmed a certain kind of wealthy customer, and a foundation that specialized in urban renewal. His face was on billboards and the city council's donor lists. His money flowed into neighborhoods he argued he wanted to lift, and sometimes it did. For Izzy, who had been plucked from a life of volatile grips and replaced, literally and legally, with everything Gideon could give, the duality of gilded generosity and street-level grit was not an intellectual curiosity. It was the air she breathed. Before he became the target of headlines that painted him as reckless, Gideon had been something simpler at home, a man who boiled water for too long and who could never get the thermostat right. He taught Izzy that a good deal had a spine. He taught her, too, with a kind of awkward tenderness, how to read contracts, how to hold a microphone, how to sign a check without letting the hand tremble. He could not teach her how to listen to the notes a gearbox made when it was unhappy. That knowledge she had taken from the other places, the cramped bays of Leo's auto, the afternoons under a tin roof, the smell of solvent, and the rhythm of hammer against metal. Before he adopted her, Gideon had found Izzy watching the way a mechanic coaxed a seized engine into compromise, her knuckles raw from holding the rim of a busted pulley. He had offered her a life without ash and grease. She had taken it and kept the old habits like a secret talisman. Months before the night the car almost rolled, Henderson Lane buzzed with a rumor like a hissing wire. Hale's name in connection with a string of failing vehicles. At first, it was a luxury sedan that cut out on a city overpass, the sort of headline that extracts a gasp. Then two more, a high-profile client who complained of a catastrophic failure during a demonstration, a valet car that conked out in front of a five-star hotel, the chauffeur swearing it had been fine at the last inspection. It didn't matter that the incidents were technically isolated. People loved patterns. Journalists loved patterns more. The rival shop, March & Sons, a surprisingly modern chain of boutique garages owned by Darius March, ran its ads with a crisp cruelty, like a promise designed to exploit doubt. "Where performance matters," their slogan read, and beneath it, a smiling mechanic in designer overalls, the logos of brands they specialized in stitched into his chest. Izzy watched everything like a mechanic listening for a misfire. She didn't stand at podiums or call into panels. She stayed in the margins, at the shop floor of Hale's vehicle division when the engineers left for the day, at the cafe where drivers swapped gripes in the shadow of the valet stand at the Meridian. She found connections in crumbs, a series of invoices with a line item missing, a shipment manifest that had been welded with red ink, voices on a recording that hesitated when a name came up, a pattern of competitors showing up just often enough to replace a client's confidence. The first explicit sign of sabotage, if sabotage it was, came on a Monday morning when a demonstrator car meant to showcase Hale's new adaptive suspension suddenly clattered and stalled in front of a courtyard where Gideon was scheduled to speak. The video blew up. The Senator for Urban Development in the passenger seat, Gideon on stage, applause cut short by the engine's dying wheeze. The clip did not show the tiny curled piece of metal that had been forced into a hose the night before, nor the sticky residue on a bolt that smelled faintly of a compound Izzy recognized from a summer she spent sweeping Leo's workshop. The clip only showed the halt, the embarrassed smiles, the subsequent public apology, which is another kind of wound, administered slowly and publicly. Gideon reacted to each headline the same way he always did, with a careful blend of fury and composure. He would hold a press conference, say the appropriate things. He would call lawyers. But he was also human enough to be rattled. In private, he was quieter than she had ever seen him. He'd walk around the house, touching the edges of books he didn't read, tap a pen against the mahogany like a man trying to impose a rhythm on a pulse he could not find. Izzy would watch him from the kitchen doorway and feel a strange mix of resentment and protective ferocity. He had taken her out of a place where the world had been sharp and unfair. Now, because of him, people she cared about might be hurt. Or worse, people would decide, with a slow, deliberate cruelty, that the man who had once saved her did not deserve the benefit of the doubt. "Don't let it get to you," Gideon told her one evening, when the headlines began to resemble a tide. They were in the small, cluttered study she loved, the one he never used for business, the one with a crooked photograph of a dog on the mantel. He had a cup of tea he never drank, and a file in front of him marked internal. His eyes flicked up when Izzy entered with a list of anomalies printed on discolored paper. "You don't understand," she said, because she did understand. She had learned to read machines like a gossip column. "They're coordinated. It's not just chance." "It's a smear campaign," he said, as if the phrase would make it smaller, something you could put into a box and catalog. "It's better to call it prepared," she corrected. "Someone's making things look worse. They're manufacturing failures." He looked at her, then not as the board saw him, not as a titan of industry, but as the man who had steadied a child after a storm. "Then we have to out-prepare them," he said. "We'll hire a firm. We'll get the best." Izzy did not argue. She also did not trust PR firms. Where they parried words, she wanted to pry open objects. The more obvious the response from the outside, the more she felt the real work would be done with hands and a sharpness of attention that reports and press releases could not manufacture. Her investigation began quietly, like a leak finding its way under floorboards. She went to Leo's Auto on Hollow Street, where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the coffee was always burnt. Leo was older than she remembered, cheeks sunk with decades of work, fingers the color of oil even after a bath. But when he lifted a head, his smile was immediate, forgivably pleased. He had taught Izzy how to find small lies in the way metal bent, how to see when a part had been forced, not worn. He had also taught her to tuck secrets into small pockets of conversation. "You look like you swallowed a wrench," he said when she walked in. "I need to know how someone could make a car fail without leaving a trace," she said, sitting on a stool with her feet barely touching the concrete. Leo poured a cup of coffee and handed it to her. "You mean without being seen?" "Exactly." She gave him a short account of the incidents. No tabloids, no PR spin, mentioning the missing invoices, the irregular shipments. Leo listened like a man whose tools were also his grammar. "You can jam a line," he said finally, then stopped himself. He knew the line, his face closed. "Not a good thing to say out loud if you don't want kids to try it at home, but a lot of trouble can be caused by things that look accidental." She nodded. He was careful not to teach her anything that would read like instruction. Instead, he gave her permission to keep looking. "Follow the hands," he advised. "Where are the hands that touch these cars? Who's buying the parts? How do they move money? People hide in invoices and in coffee cups. Watch the coffee pots." So she did. She sat in a cafe near March & Sons with a camera disguised as a laptop. She listened to chauffeurs complain about odd noises. She took notes that read like recipes, dates, license plates, a barista who recognized a mechanic always in the morning. The clues were small, an accumulation of tiny facts that together weighed like a witness. One night, she was rifling through a stack of old delivery manifests in a storage room at Hale's demonstration facility when she found something that made her throat tight. A line item with a serial number that did not match any of Hale's parts. The manufacturer label was faint, a smudge of ink that might have been a mistake. But beneath the smudge, she could tell it had been stamped by the same distributor Hale used. The signature on the back, illegible in the worst way, had been folded over. Someone had altered a shipment. Someone had moved a part from one ledger to another. The next thing was simpler and more human. A wrapper in the door pocket of one of the failed cars. A candy wrapper with the logo of a little shop across town that, curiously, served employees of March & Sons. It was the kind of evidence a tabloid would miss because it was too mundane. The kind of evidence Izzy collected like a child collecting stones she thought pretty. A length of tape with a fingerprint, a receipt stub that mentioned a late-night order, the way the adhesive on a bolt had a particular texture that Leo recognized from a supplier 2 towns over. She made friends with the receptionist at March & Sons. The woman, Mara, was 40 and had an observant face. They bonded over bitter coffee and mutual fatigue with men who thought Greece made them gods. Mara was careful at first. Everyone in such places was. But she let Izzy in just far enough that she could overhear whispers and notice a pattern of deliveries signed off by someone called R. Cromwell. Cromwell? Izzy murmured. The name sat like a stone in her mouth. Darius March's right-hand man was not supposed to be the one signing off on deliveries. He was the smiling face on the advertisements. Mara shrugged. You don't want to know who signs what, she said. But she slid Izzy a photo from a company holiday party. There, between 2 laughing men, was a man with a precise smile and an expensive watch. He signed things. He held authority. It was the small anomalies that proved harder to explain away. A cluster of complaints about warranty work performed at the same subcontracted shop. A technician who had been demoted and suddenly found another job across town. A social media thread from a delivery driver who joked that he preferred clean jobs, and hence the late-night stuff paid better. Izzy's list grew like a map, the lines connecting points she'd never have noticed if she'd only looked for the big things. The press releases, the headlines, the press conferences. When Gideon tried to respond with lawyers and public statements, Izzy worked under the radar. She filed FOIA requests. She checked commercial vehicle records. She compared invoices. She learned the bureaucratic patience of investigations and the curious impatience it produced, an animal that ate away at people's time. The board wanted certainty, and certainty costs money and attention. Gideon kept offering both. He tried to look like everyone's steady anchor and, in private, paced like a man listening too closely for the sound of approaching waves. The rivals' campaign evolved with a kind of deliberate art. Failures were small at first, engine hiccups or idiosyncratic sensor errors that would be written off by sympathetic columnists as teething problems in any complex system. Then there were the failures that were not mechanical at all, but narrative, leaked emails, anonymous posts, hinting at cover-ups, a thread that suggested that some of Hale's vehicles were unsafe. People began to move away. Dealerships reported clients canceling demos. Investors murmured. A board member who owed Darius a favor slid his resignation across a conference table like a gentle blade. Izzy's investigations kept pointing toward March & Sons, but conclusive proof remained frustratingly out of reach. She needed a smoking gun, or at least a metal shard big and ugly enough to say, with incontrovertible boldness, that someone had been planting evidence and buying silence. And then the incidents escalated. On a rain-slacked evening, Gideon agreed to attend a charity gala out of obligation to the foundation that shared his name. He protested that he did not feel like the center of any storm, but guilt had taught him that staying away felt like abandoning the people who relied on his public visibility, an uncomfortable obligation he took seriously. Izzy went with him partly because it was easier to watch him from the ballroom's periphery than to read another sentence about his reckless disregard. She did not plan on being the person who would be in the right place at a dangerous moment. She only wanted to keep an eye on the cars limousined in and out. They stepped into a soft night lit by fairy lights and the hum of well-fed conversations. A valet took Gideon's keys and promised his usual care. The car was a sleek, near-silent model from Hale's own roster designed to soothe the paranoid. It was also something people were watching, something that could either be evidence of reliability or a new piece of ammunition in a smear. Gideon's driver lifted him into the rear seat with a practiced gentleness. As they pulled away 2 blocks from the event, the car's digital display flickered and the media of the evening, cell phones, lit up in a scatter of notifications. A crowd on the curb craned toward the street. There was no human cry, only the particular, awful language of machinery accusing itself. A little shudder that sounded like a throat clearing, then a deep rolling knock that suggested something larger had gone wrong. The driver pulled to the side. For a moment everyone expected what would come. The car would die. The reaction would be embarrassment. But then the knock came again, louder, angrier, and the car dipped as if a foot had been pressed at the edge of balance. Izzy was close enough to see the driver's hand slide to the emergency lever, an instinctive, reflexive motion, and to know with the same certainty she could have had from reading the letters on a dashboard that the vehicle was not failing of its own accord. Someone had prepared it. She remembers the motion of her lungs that night as if they were a set of springs. She recalls the simple vertical of Gideon's hand as he reached for her, not for support, but as if to tribute the manner in which she had stood since she was small, upright and alert. Then the car lurched. The driver's hands were borne to the wheel, but not to this. The lateral momentum began to build, a force that felt like a tide pushing a small boat sideways and over. What happened in the next 20 seconds is a blur often retold, with the gleam of cinematic slow motion. She saw flashes of metal, the widening eyes of the driver, the crunch of a curb against a wheel. She moved because movement was the only option that would let the event end in a way that did not include Gideon's body folded into ruined steel. She did not go for a stint at heroism. She went because she had the reflexes of someone who had spent afternoons wrestling bulky engines into compromise. She reached for a handle. She hit a shoulder. She braced her feet. There was a particular scream, half animal, half human, from someone in the crowd. Her body slammed into the car's frame. For a second, the whole world tilted with the vehicle. And then, by a fraction of an inch, by a sliver of stubborn human force, the car's trajectory changed. It slid, rocked, and settled rather than flipping. The crowd surged, some toward them with applause, some back with the recoil of menace. Gideon sat silent for a moment. His face was pale. He looked at Izzy with a gratitude that had no public statement for it. In the hours that followed, as lights around the city blinked and reporters rehearsed the word miraculous, Izzy's mind moved to a place where miracle and method blurred. Someone had tried to end him, maybe because taking him out would render a larger, profitable plan unstoppable. Or perhaps someone wanted to frighten him, to engineer a panic big enough to crack the company's veneers. Whatever the intent, it was deliberate. She felt the tectonic sense of having been noticed. A plan had been interrupted, and the people who'd put it together would be angry. She told the driver it was sabotage in the terse way of someone laying claim to a truth that might be dismissed as bias. "We need a forensic sweep," she said. The driver, a man called Ramon, nodded as if he had not expected less. They were allowed to take the car back to Hale's secure lot. Forensics arrived with instruments and gloves, tapping at things that looked to her like her old life. Metal filings, a smear that could have been adhesive. They taped off the wheel well. A technician noted the residue with a practiced eye. Someone from Darius March's office called and offered condolences, a soft-toned voice reciting platitudes that sounded antiseptic. It was the small things they found when they thought the night could not get stranger that made the case start to look like a wound with teeth. Buried under the inner trim, tucked in an impossible pocket, there was a tiny fragment of a polymer that did not belong to any of Hale's supply chains. Its composition matched a type of tape used exclusively by a particular subcontractor known to work with March & Sons. On the dashcam there was a timestamp glitch, and the corrected sequence showed a van seen in the vicinity twice in the preceding weeks, a repair van emblazoned with a logo that had been scrubbed from the city registry the year before, but which Izzy remembered from a faded sticker on Leo's old toolbox. She kept pushing, calling in favors that Gideon's money could not entirely buy, and which he was increasingly reluctant to accept. "Let her work," he told his legal counsel once when there was talk of keeping her away for her own safety. The board considered him inconsiderate, a father citing a daughter's intuition in lieu of proper investigative procedure. But intuition had become evidence that night. The more she dug, the more the pattern looked less like a gossip and more like an economy. A company here burned through contracts, picking up clients who began to report a strange phenomenon. Vehicles they'd entrusted for performance tuning later developed odd, recurring issues. The same subcontractor showed up in payment ledgers that had been annotated in the same blue ink. The same van ran routes past Gideon's properties. The van's license plate belonged to a driver who had a name on a chain, a man once fired from Hale's maintenance crew for irregular hours, who had found employment at March & Sons shortly after his dismissal. There were threats, too, small things that arrived in the form of anonymous emails and unmarked envelopes containing pictures of Gideon's house with a circle drawn around the driveway. A lobbyist in Hale's circle received an offer to switch allegiances framed like a favor but clearly a demand. A former employee who'd been vocal in support of Gideon's practices found his bills mysteriously called in by union allies. It was a squeeze, applied in multiple places at once. People with power learned to inflict pressure where it hurt, in the boardroom, in the neighborhood, in the reputations of men whose names were their capital. Then one morning, a low-level mechanic named Julio, quiet, thin, with apology in his posture, came to Izzy with a trembling fistful of photos and a confession. He'd been hired, he said, to plant failure markers on certain cars. He had not known whose cars they were at the time. He had not known what his actions would become, only that he was paid more than he'd been paid anywhere else in months. His voice broke when he said it. He told a story of a superior him called R. Of a van that visited the garages after dark, of stickers peeled away and parts swapped in the back rooms. "Why are you telling me?" Izzy asked. "Because you were nice," he said, and there was a kind of humility in that. "You spoke to me like I was not a thing people could use." Julio's confession was not enough to convict anyone. It was, however, a badly needed vein of coal that could be shaped into flame. She took his photographs, blurry shots of the van, a driver's profile, the logo she had seen somewhere else, and matched them with shipping receipts. For the first time, the dots she had been connecting began to darken into a line. The van's service logs showed an irregular loop. It serviced 7 of the affected cars within a month. The payment trail, once she had it distilled through a game of corporate obfuscation and friendly accountants, showed transfers that led back through a shell company and then, impossibly, to a bank account with ties to March & Sons. Gideon's name was under siege in the papers, but in private things were fraying for him on another axis. He had wanted in his way to be the kind of man who could take back the narrative by press conferences and donations. What he had not wanted was the public sense that he was vulnerable to the same old city games he had once vowed to end. He had made promises in rooms filled with people who wanted the world ordered and safe, and who believed that money could turn a messy reality tidy. The scandal was not just personal. It put his work at risk. Would donors withdraw? Would partners distance themselves? These questions made his mouth thin. That night, after the car that should have flipped but did not, they brought the vehicle into a Hale facility for an overnight examination. Izzy watched as men in white coats moved around it, their gestures precise and almost ritualistic. She stood in the glass-walled observation room like someone listening to prayers in a language she didn't know. It was there, as the lights took a softer tenor and the city, outside, slowed to its nightly hum, that she found the envelope. It was folded in half and tucked under a stack of service forms, half hidden by a paperweight. At first she thought it was a mistake. Then she fingered the seal and the edge of the envelope, and a tiny corner of a wrapper slipped out. It was the same paper, from the vendor near March & Sons. The angle of it suggested it had been placed there deliberately. She took it to Leo. His face, when he opened it, was unreadable. Inside was a photo series, a shot of a van leaving Hale's demo lot at 3 a.m, a timestamp barely visible, a shot of a hand with the same kind of smudge that had shown up in the earlier part, and, worst of all, a photo that showed the emblem of a supplier with a neat scrawl of a signature, R. Cromwell, beneath it. "You shouldn't have this," Leo said softly. "I should," Izzy said, because she did not feel afraid in the way people expected. Fear was a thing you catalogued and shoved into boxes if you wanted to keep working. "You know that name." He did. He had seen R. Cromwell's name on invoices, on contract sign-offs, on the margins of agreements tied to March & Sons. Leo's jaw tightened. "This ties people to actions," he said, "but it's not a smoking gun on its own." "No." She folded the photos and slid them back into the envelope like a card in a deck. "But it's where we start." They did not sleep much that week. Izzy flew through legal requests and private interrogations, pressing for camera footage, buying time with offers of sealed documents and NDAs. They were careful, not because Gideon was fragile, but because revelation required strategy. A wrong leak could make the accusation seem desperate. A correct leak could hurt the people they were trying to protect. For the first time, Gideon listened to her strategy rather than dismiss it. When they ran the forensic analysis, the findings were precise enough to make a press conference meaningful. The polymer tape was matched to a specific run sold to March & Sons subcontractor. The fingerprint on a piece of adhesive matched a technician who had resigned from Hale 9 months earlier, only to reappear on a March payroll. The payment trail, once you knew how to read it for vanity and obfuscation, curled like a snake toward the same central hub. But the city loved spectacle, and spectacles needed more than lab reports. The rival's machine of denial was ready. Darius March sent out a statement of indignation, his tone oily and practiced. Any suggestion of sabotage was a desperate maneuver by those who could not accept industry evolution. He smiled in his press photographs, like a man who had never known a shortage of allies. Gideon's name, meanwhile, chewed at the margins of public conversation. Late one night, as they watched the news feeds and the phone lines sang with questions, Oswald Ward, a private investigator they'd hired quietly, walked into the study with a look like a man who had come from a long tunnel to daylight. He placed a thin folder on Gideon's desk. Inside were surveillance stills, emails, and a list of accounts. The pages were annotated in a precise, almost beautiful hand. "We have someone willing to talk," he said. Izzy leaned forward. "Who?" "A courier. He's nervous. But he saw the van make a regular sweep and admitted to delivering little packages to a storage unit on the west side. He swears he was paid cash and told not to ask. He said the man who gave him the cash had an expensive watch and a neat smile. The PI's face was not triumphant. "This is only good if it holds under cross-examination." "It will," Izzy said, but she did not know it would. She only knew that each thread they pulled seemed to suggest the fabric had been cut on purpose, and someone was trying very hard to keep those edges from fraying. The courier, when they found him, was called Manuel. He spoke in a voice that trembled not from fear of prison, but from the weight of complicity. He drew a map in the dirt of a parcel route and scribbled a time and place. He mentioned a name the man at March used internally, R. Cromwell, over and over in a pitiful kind of confession, like a child reciting the name of a bully to a parent who would do nothing. Manuel's hands shook as he handed them a receipt, a coffee-stained slip that indicated change given for cash. It was a small object in a city of small objects that could become evidence with a little intent. Yet even then, after the courier and the forensics, there was a sense of unseen hands elsewhere, someone who anticipated moves and countered them with an economy of social capital. March and Sons had lobbyists and patrons, and a reputation manufactured over years. They did not go down easily. Gideon's legal team counseled caution. The board argued for a calculated release of the evidence. Darius March's PR machine hired a pundit who spoke in rectangles of denial. It was the kind of slow, calculated pressure that made heroes or martyrs of men. Gideon did not want martyrdom. He wanted the truth. He wanted to be exonerated not by platitudes, but by a legal writing. He kept saying in the clipped voice of a man who had been taught that public statements were tools, "We will let the facts speak for themselves." Izzy wanted them to speak loud enough to drown out the lies. She also wanted to ensure the person who had tried to topple him would not be able to reconstitute themselves in some other form. That night the city sounded like a not-quite-closed wound. Helicopters folding away, radios muttering, neighbors waking to check their phones. In the low rooms of Hale's house, under the hush of a house that did not sleep, Izzy moved as if she carried an urgency that belonged to someone else's clock. She had moved the evidence into a small folder and placed it on Gideon's desk like a declaration. He had read the pages, and then, for the first time since the first headline, his face had hardened into something close to outrage that matched her own. They did not go to the police immediately. They had learned the cost of rushing, of letting the story run without a frame, and the city had a talent for turning half-truths into myths. Instead, with Gideon's cautious blessing and Oswald Ward's steady hand, they assembled the kind of team that spoke in subpoenas and late-night interviews. Leo came in with grease under his nails and an insistence on modesty that Izzy loved. Julio and Manuel were promised anonymity in exchange for telling the truth. Oswald threaded their testimonies together into a map. At dawn, the legal process that felt like an engine warming up began to spin. Warrants were sought for the storage unit the courier named. Bank records were subpoenaed. A forensic team excavated digital files like archaeologists. The work had the hum of a fabrication shop. Measure twice, cut once. Only the materials were records and memories. Izzy watched, feeling again the old apprentice rhythm, patience offset by sudden, necessary moves. What turned the investigation from probable to prosecutable was a small, stubborn piece of bookkeeping. Buried in a sequence of transactions, between the bland nomenclature of consulting fees and logistic charges, an account opened under a shell company name paid for a regular delivery service that matched the van's stop patterns. The money was small in the ledger of corporate war, but it traced the route the sabotage took. The funds traveled outward from a March & Sons credit line through an intermediary. They landed in a clearinghouse and then, impossibly, were routed to an envelope of cash payments Manuel recognized handing out in the lot behind one of March's suburban depots. The chain was neither elegant nor clever. It was mercenary and greasy, and that sloppiness was what made it traceable. With the warrants in hand, a multi-jurisdictional team moved at night. They took the storage unit on the west side in a quiet raid, men in plain clothes and gloves breathing a reverent hush as they uncovered cardboard boxes, Velcro-bound tools, rolls of polymer tape, and tucked into the corner like a bad confession, an organized stack of invoices with March & Sons letterhead and signatures scrawled in the same hand that had appeared on earlier pieces of paper. Among these invoices there were also handwritten notes, times, license plates, and the names of the cars to be handled on particular nights. There was a ledger with dates arranged like a butcher's schedule. When they traced one of the invoices back to the March & Sons supply chain, the name R. Cromwell sprang off the paper like a bruise. He was, according to public material, a mid-level operations manager. Tidy suits, no scandal, a face that appeared in the softer company newsletters. But men like him, Oswald said, were the kind who kept their hands clean precisely by having other hands do the dirty work. They arrested Cromwell as he left the office late one morning, a coffee cup still in his hand and a public relations brief shoved under his arm. He reacted with a numb indignation that was designed to astonish. Indignation is a practiced emotion, and Cromwell's performance was slick. He denied knowledge, claimed administrative ignorance, and complained of being scapegoated. Yet when the evidence, emails with timestamps that dovetailed with the courier's receipts, a password-protected folder on his laptop containing delivery manifests and notes, arrived at the prosecutor's desk. His denial shrank. Confronted with the ledger from the storage unit and the polymer samples that matched the items in his custody records, his voice lost its polish. He asked for a lawyer. The face of March and Sons, however, remained smooth. Darius March issued statements in measured tones. "We cooperate fully with any legitimate inquiry." He cast the accusation as the predictable tantrum of a competitor and framed Hale's actions as the overreach of a man hurt by market realities. His public persona was a lesson in corporate tightrope walking, feigned benevolence, an insistence on fairness, an offended expression at the suggestion of wrongdoing within his company. But behind the carefully scripted quotes were rawer things. A board sweating a marketing budget that needed to be reallocated, an investor who wanted clarity yesterday. Under the pressure of warrants and search orders, more of the operation folded. Julio's initial frightened confession now lined up with shipping manifests. Manuel's receipts matched debit card withdrawals traced from March and Sons' petty accounts. A technician who had once worked nights at the depots, when shown an image of a small piece of polymer tape, paused and then told Oswald in a rough voice that he'd seen that exact run in a crate labeled as specialty adhesives. A crate signed out by an assistant who had given the same initials that appeared on multiple delivery slips. It was not a tidy conspiracy with a single mastermind at the top. It was a constructed economy of favors, an apparatus of plausible deniability, but the apparatus left fingerprints. There were texts between Cromwell and a vendor with the subject line, Ops Plan. There were transfers from March and Sons to a shell company named for an address that led to a mailbox facility used by a law firm associated with Darius's favorite fixers. The picture that emerged was not of a company-wide conspiracy, but of a deliberate, compartmentalized operation organized by people who believed the ends justified careful obfuscation. At a press conference months after the first incident, with cameras arrayed and a stack of documents behind him, Gideon spoke with a voice calmer than his tempo in private. He did not invent heroics. He thanked the teams and acknowledged the harms the incidents had cost other drivers and owners. He did not gloat. The public needed the facts, and the facts, laid out by prosecutors and corroborated by forensics, began to tell a different story than the tabloids had. Cromwell was indicted on multiple counts: conspiracy, fraud, tampering with consumer goods. Several technicians and couriers pleaded guilty to participating in the scheme in exchange for reduced sentences and for their cooperation in testifying. Darius March's role remained more complicated. Evidence tied funds to a March credit line and spoke to awareness in parts of his operation. He had, it turned out, met with investors who urged aggressive campaigns to win market share. He had muttered in internal messages about neutralizing risk and managing narratives, but a courtroom requires more than muttered boardroom language. The prosecutors moved carefully. They charged the operative network in Cromwell. They opened a formal investigation into the company's leadership, requesting board minutes and email correspondence. For the public, the difference between being investigated and being convicted was a chasm. March's brand took hits in the press, but Darius himself remained a figure of insulated outrage, suing for defamation in one breath and defending his company in another. The small victories were public and intimate. Julio and Manuel, in their statements, described the pressure that had pushed them toward the work. Money, fear, a sense that no one would notice their absence. They had been men who needed work and got caught in a system that rewarded discretion. Their confessions were not theatrical. They were a kind of unburdening. In exchange for cooperating, they received leniency and, more importantly to Izzy, help. Gideon set up restitution funds for owners whose vehicles had been damaged. Hale Industries committed to auditing supply chains and establishing an independent oversight board that would include Leo and representatives from small shops across town. Leo's name, once the quiet signature on Izzy's formative years, became part of the public story of restoration. Gideon announced an initiative, a foundation grant, to underwrite independent workshops and apprenticeships to ensure the city's mechanics were not forced into shadow labor by corporate pressure. The foundation's money would open a new location for Leo's Auto, a modest shop with better lifts, a small classroom, and a radiator fan that whirred like a heart in good health. Leo wept once, in a way he never had around Izzy before, simple tears for the recognition, for the chance to teach more hands the language of metal. The press could not help turning the story into a moral fable, the billionaire redeemed by the child he adopted. The underdog mechanic turned public defender of truth. Izzy bristled at such simplifications. She knew, intimately, the small arithmetic of fear, how it could buy silence and how it could be bought back. The narrative the cameras wanted was tidy. The truth was a series of messy, human choices. When the indictment papers arrived for Cromwell, the city exhaled. The trial that followed was a drawn-out procedural thing, with a rhythm of legal maneuvering that tested patience. Motions filed, sealed exhibits, testimony that sometimes felt like a stalemate of credibility. Yet, in the witness stand, the technicians and couriers gave the story a human cadence. Manuel described cash exchanges and the shape of the van he'd driven overnights. Julio spoke, hand-trembling, of being told not to ask questions. A forensic analyst explained, without diagrams that would be dangerous to replicate, that the polymer fragments were found in places they should not be, and that their composition linked them to a supplier that did business directly with March & Sons' subcontractor. Little things that might have been ignored. An adhesive smear in the same place across affected vehicles, a delivery van's GPS pings that overlapped with the failed car's locations, became stitches in a fabric no defense could easily pull out. Cromwell's defense, lean and practiced, painted him as a scapegoat, a manager tasked with problem-solving who made choices in a pressured environment. He claimed plausible deniability, but one witness, a junior accountant who had been quietly coerced into adjusting a ledger entry, told a different story. "I was told to make things balance," she said, voice tiny beneath the legal lights. "I did not understand what I was writing into the ledger. I thought it was marketing." Her testimony, simple and exhausted, was a hinge. The verdict, when it came, was a quiet thing in a loud room. Cromwell was found guilty on several counts. He received a sentence that to some might have read as lenient. To others it was a necessary statement. Acts that endangered lives for profit would no longer be dismissed as mere business risk. Cromwell's conviction was not a miracle. It was the grinding result of meticulous work, of people who counted receipts, tracks on the road, and the faint residue that a careless hand left behind. Meanwhile, other consequences unfolded in quieter, bureaucratic ways. March & Sons faced civil suits, contract cancellations, and a board reshuffle. Investors, skittish by nature, demanded audits. Customers moved cars elsewhere, and wherever March & Sons had hung a sign promising safety and performance, there were now awkward conversations. Darius March maintained his public innocence, but lost a coalition of clients who preferred not to be associated with scandal. The market is a blunt arbiter, and reputation, once cleaved, does not regrow overnight. The city, for its part, changed small things. The municipal fleet tightened oversight of subcontracting. A local association of independent mechanics, long simmering at the edge of relevance, found donors and an audience. Gideon's Foundation funded classes that taught not conspiratorial sabotage, but the basics of supply chain transparency and worker protections. Leo's shop became a place where people came for honest work and also for a cup of coffee and a story that reassured the neighborhood that not everything valuable could be bought or hidden. Through all this, Izzy walked the public and the private lines carefully. She was thanked in speeches, but refused any senseless elevation to myth. She sat through deposition rooms and gave evidence about patterns rather than heroics. She took part in the forensic team's briefings and learned to read the language of auditors. Her skills, the old ones learned under a tin roof, had translated into a different kind of literacy, noticing, connecting, refusing to let tiny anomalies be dismissed. She watched Gideon, who had always been a man of numbers, learn a new humility. He listened more than he spoke in the weeks after the verdict, and the two of them rebuilt, slowly, a vocabulary of family that included truth as a non-negotiable. There were moments of real tenderness. On a rainy afternoon months after the trial, they stood in Leo's new bay, watching a younger mechanic tighten a bolt on a restored sedan. The shop smelled like solvent and a new radiator, the kind of smell that meant work and honest exchange. Gideon wrapped a shawl around his shoulders and said, without flattery and with an earnestness that had been tempered by fear, "I'm sorry I ever thought sheltering you was enough." He meant something more than physical protection. He meant the kind of shelter that had kept her from the rough edges that shaped her instincts. Izzy, who had learned to measure compassion not by words but by acts, let the admission pass into the comfortable place between them. She pressed a hand to his forearm and said, "You did more than shelter me. You gave me time to decide who I wanted to be. I could have been angry, but I learned that time is a kind of grace." Their hands stayed together, a quiet contract. The final pages of the public story were less cinematic than the opening scene the cameras had loved. There were settlements reached between Hale Industries and a handful of private clients who'd suffered losses. There were quiet donations to community repair co-ops. There was a ceremony where Leo cut a ribbon, and Gideon addressed a crowd of mechanics and apprentices. He emphasized in a speech that avoided triumphalism that industry must be accountable, and that the city's strength lay in its networks of people who saw one another. It would have been too tidy to end with everyone reconciled and forgiven in a single paragraph. Not everyone found restoration. Careers stalled where suspicion had lodged. Some technicians were blackballed by employers, wary of any hint of a nuisance, but in many small ways the balance shifted. The technicians who had spoken now had avenues to rebuild. The apprentices in Leo's workshop had a model of transparency and an axis of mentorship that tied them to a different ethic. Izzy's place in the world settled into a shape that suited her. Gideon offered her a formal position overseeing safety and supply chain integrity within Hale's automotive division. It was a tempting title with powerful letters, but she negotiated a different arrangement. She would keep one foot in the company, enough to change things from inside, but she would also be an adjunct partner to Leo's workshop, funded by the foundation, to ensure that independent businesses had an advocate at the table. Gideon agreed, perhaps understanding that her effectiveness came from straddling both worlds. On a bright morning in the spring that followed the legal dust, Izzy opened the repaired doors to a new training room at Leo's. Young men and women entered with notebooks and grease marks, and she found herself teaching something like a creed. Look for pattern, trust small clues, protect people more than profit. She did not romanticize the work. She told them that the world was often messy and that ethics required diligence. Leo stood in the back, smiling to himself, as if no one had ever told him he was allowed to be publicly proud. There was a quiet ceremony months later in Gideon's house. He and Izzy sat at a kitchen table, the same one where she had once laid out a list of anomalies on discolored paper. The city was less concerned with the scandal now. News cycles moved, and with their passing, the public's appetite for drama diminished. But for the two of them, the thing that remained was simpler than headlines. Trust measured in small acts. "You saved me," Gideon said finally, the words not flung anywhere, but placed like a careful coin on the table. "You taught me to see," Izzy answered. "You let me keep the part of me that listens to the way a thing fails. That's why I could stop it." He reached for her. There was no show of spectacle, only an ordinary touch that steadied them both. They sat together as the late light collapsed across the table, and in the narrow, ordinary way that real reconciliation takes shape, they said things that echoed and then became ordinary. Apologies, plans, the tiny logistics of living in a world that could be both generous and cruel. The city's applause was less thunderous than the night cameras had captured the rescue, but in the neighborhoods where mechanics talked and shared tea, the story took on a quieter resonance. People spoke of time, not as a dramatic pivot, but as fragments that, when noticed, build a life. The seconds Izzy had used to change a car's fate, the weeks of paperwork that fixed a lie, the long months of rebuilding trust. Her act did not erase the harm done. It interrupted a pattern that might otherwise have grown. In the months that followed, Izzy learned another kind of patience. She read board minutes with the same careful curiosity she once reserved for engine wines. She sat in legislative panels that debated better protections for consumer goods. She visited community centers and heard stories about lives upended by cynical decisions. Each story returned her to the same humility. Heroics can change moments, but lasting change required the less glamorous work of oversight, teaching, and repair. There was one last thing Gideon did that mattered to Izzy more than any public accolade. He stood at a small gathering of friends and neighbors, Leo among them, and announced that Hale Industries would provide a grant to create a citywide registry for parts and suppliers. "If a car is examined," he said simply, "we will have an open ledger, nothing secret to hide behind." The statement was not a giant step for industry, but it was a crucial one for a city that had learned to prize transparency after a near-tragic moment. When the crowd dispersed, Izzy and Gideon walked down the street without an entourage. The lights on the shop fronts glowed warm as they passed. They told each other about small things, about the smell of coffee at dawn, about the way Leo's kids had learned to strip a carburetor under supervision. They did not speak in platitudes. They spoke in particulars because particulars had saved them. A wrapper tucked into a door pocket, a ledger entry, a courier who could not carry his secret any longer. The memory of the night the car leaned toward catastrophe stayed with them, etched into muscles, into reflexes, into a shared language of minutes. It never became a tale of destiny. It remained, instead, an account of decisions. The choice Izzy made to move, the choice Gideon made to trust her instincts, the choice of the couriers who finally told the truth, of the technicians who came forward. Each decision was ordinary in itself and extraordinary in its consequences. On the anniversary of that night, a quiet remembrance took place in front of Leo's auto. They had a small plaque, simple brass, mounted beside the door of the shop, not to commemorate a person alone, but to mark the moment a community decided to value vigilance. It read, in modest letters, "For those who notice." People who had been part of the story came, some awkwardly, some with relief, to stand in the drizzle and remember. Cameras were present, but they took fewer pictures and left sooner. The city had, in small ways, learned a lesson more durable than any headline. Izzy stood back from the group and watched the trainees at work. She felt a kinship with the worn hands turning wrenches and the people who kept the city running in ways the skyline would never show. She had rescued her father in a single, consequential instant. What she had learned since was that rescue rippled outward in complex patterns. She had also reclaimed something vital for herself, the right to belong not just to a name, but to a practice and a people. If you watched until the end, if the twist of a car and a woman's quickness kept you on the edge, tell us which clue in the investigation surprised you most. And if you want more stories about small acts changing large outcomes, check the link to another episode that digs into a different kind of rescue.